Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the topic of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, it's our pleasure to present the 1999 Cuban feature film, Las Profecías de Amanda, Amanda's Prophecies. This film is based upon an actual case in Cuba and is about a woman with, perhaps, paranormal powers. It's directed by the veteran Pastor Vega, and it stars one of the great actresses of the Spanish-speaking film world, Daisy Granados. We'll be talking about the film's theme, its actress, and a number of other things after the screening. Please join us when it'll be my pleasure to have as a guest Professor Francisco Soto, a noted expert on contemporary Cuban culture, as our guest. Now, enjoy the mystery of Las Profecías de Amanda. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed this extraordinary performance by Daisy Granados in a film I think of significant interest for a whole set of reasons. We have 30 minutes to chat about those reasons and this film. It's a pleasure to have here today on City Cinematheque one of my colleagues from the university, Professor Francisco Soto from the College of Staten Island, where he's a professor of Spanish and Latin American literature. These days, although he doesn't have a hat on in front of us, he is wearing the hat of the acting dean of humanities out at the college. He's a noted scholar of contemporary and modern Cuban literature, culture, and film. Pleasure to have you here on CUNY TV.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Let's start with maybe the central fact of this film, and that central fact isn't really the paranormal. I think the central fact is Daisy Granados.
By all means, by all means.
Okay. For somebody, let's pretend somebody doesn't know who she is for the moment. Give us a sense of who she is and why it's important that you have a film with a protagonist who happens to be the actor Daisy Granados.
Right. I think one of the most interesting things about the film is the whole idea of gender, that is, Cuban women in society. Now, what's interesting about Daisy Granados is, of course, that in 1979 she starred in a very famous movie. It's called Retrato de Teresa, Portrait of Teresa, which also has to do with the role of the contemporary woman in revolutionary society. And here we have her 20 years later, now in a different role. We see her again passing through different stages in her life. That is, as a child, she is relegated to the space of the private home. Right. She can't even fit in school because, she's just too out there, too different. Later on, we see that, she decides that it's important for her to get out of her house, so she marries someone just to escape. But we see a woman that's going through a transition. That is, she wants to claim a voice for herself. She wants to be visible. And by the end of the movie, that's what she's claiming, and that's what she achieves. Now, granted, Amanda is on the fringe. Teresa in 1979 was not on the fringe. Right. She was a true revolutionary woman who was beginning to understand the revolution and her role as a woman in that revolution. So to see Daisy, do these two roles is quite interesting.
Yeah, and I want to, for some people might have seen, or if they haven't seen, gosh, they should get the cassette.
Yes.
Memories of Underdevelopment.
And she was also in that also, which was a very famous movie because it was based on a novel by Edmundo de Snoes, obviously. So it's a very
yeah, and one of the interesting things about her role in that, to just sort of chart her through very different stages in her life, but also very different stages in Cuban filmmaking and its relationship to the society, is in that she plays a young, working class Cuban girl who's seduced by an slightly older, about around 40, but upper class to upper middle class hanger-on, a fellow there. And so she is somebody who's at that moment from the margins, because she has no idea what the revolution is, nor her family. They know it's changed them. So she plays somebody who thinks she wants to be a movie star,
right.
In that, but has no real clue about what that really means. A very strong contrast with someone like Amanda,
right.
in this particular picture, who really keeps standing up for herself in any circumstance in which she can do so.
Right, by all means she does. As you said before, I think to have an actress like Daisy Granados do this role and to remember her in previous movies, like you mentioned, is important, because I think we go back to the question of what is the role of women in Cuban society, a role that has evolved since the beginning of the revolution in '59, obviously to the present. But what I find fascinating is that she, as I said before, on the fringe. She's different, right. And her difference is interesting because there's an attempt in the movie to welcome her into the society. But it's very difficult to do because they can't make sense of who she is and why she does what she does. But that leads me to another interesting point about the movie, which has to do with the whole idea of knowledge. Western scientific, analysis or scientific method versus what is the Caribbean and other forms of knowledge or sabiduría, one might say. I think the movie, wrestles with those two, and I think indeed. That's really, at the basis of what's going on in the story.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point to me because it begins in a very specific context of this character, but it has larger implications.
Yes.
And I want to talk about that in a couple of ways. First of all, in the harshest moments of the adoption of a Soviet form of a model of analysis, of so-called scientific Marxism
right.
about these things, it simply meant that people were put in the position of not being able to include, at least officially, in their lives, features that have been a traditional part of the culture,
of the Cuban culture,
and not we're not talking about those people just from the countryside or those people just
right.
from working class neighborhoods at all. So there had to be an official denial to bring people into an official alliance with what the official line
right.
was in that way. And here we actually have this being staged as a debate
right.
about what are the limits of scientific
right.
knowledge. And we see her encounter folks
right.
at different moments who give her very different answers about whether
By all means, right. I think right from the beginning of the movie, we have that epigraph at the beginning. It says something like, Horace, what was it again? Something, your philosophy doesn't know as much as what is in heaven and earth.
Right.
That is, there's limitations to
right.
your philosophy, which is a Western
from Hamlet,
tradition.
right.
From Western tradition, right? And then there's that song, which we don't hear the lyrics in the, or we don't see the lyrics in the subtitles, which have to do with the truth. They say Nostradamus didn't have the truth, Jesus didn't have the truth, Hare Krishna didn't have the truth. Teachers don't teach the truth, which leads us into that very first scene where we have the little girl, Amanda, who's in the classroom and obviously doesn't fit, right? She's
right.
different,
right.
right? And they don't know what to make of her. So, and then what do? They send her to a doctor, to a psychologist, right? Who examines her, gives her some blocks, and then what is the first thing he says to the parents who are there? He says to the mother, "Why don't you leave now? I want to talk to the father." Very patriarchal,
absolutely,
right response, right? And it's the first in a series of doctors throughout the movie that will somehow not help her, or they attempt to help her, but they do not help her. And there's this clash because the scientific method cannot understand something like what Amanda has,
right.
these profecías that she has, right? Which is something that we see, many critics have looked at this in contemporary Cuban culture. We can go back to Fernando Ortiz in his book on contrapunteo, right? Which is the idea, he's the first one who mentions Afro-Cuban, the idea that we're not talking about a synthesis here. We're talking about two things coexisting, right? Most recently, we have Antonio Benítez Rojo, who publishes in '89 La Isla que se repite, which was,
Repeating Island.
The Repeating Island, right, which came out by Duke University Press, where he talks about this idea that in the Caribbean, there's another type of knowledge, otro tipo de sabiduría, he says, right, which coexists with the Western scientific method, right? So there's not a synthesis here. Right? But it's a difficult thing because the doctors or using a traditional scientific method can't see beyond this, which leads us to that very famous scene in the movie where all the doctors are in that big room, which is a fascinating moment in the movie, I think.
Absolutely, and one of the interesting things is the way in which the question is posed in that conversation is, well, there's a couple of oppositions that come up. There's one of, we all agree that this exists, but what position do we take about it? Is this something that we need to suppress, or is this something that we need to open up to people? And then, as that debate goes on, they actually start going back to first principles.
Right.
And that's interesting, because one of the things they say is, well, wait a minute, you're speaking in a Newtonian manner.
Right.
You think you can know things in certain ways.
Absolutes, exactly. Right.
They're absolutes.
And they question them, right, exactly. There's one moment where I think it was a female scientist and her colleague were saying, well, you know, you have to use the scientific method. You have to proceed this way. It's the only way we can get data, right? And then the Venezuelan doctor, who's obviously is studying Amanda, and her colleague, who was actually her lover too. We learn, I think his name is Fernando, question that approach. They say, but she's here, she exists. We have to be able to explain it somehow. And if the scientific method doesn't work, the traditional Western scientific method, we have to find other ways of explaining this. And then there's a moment where he says something, and I think the woman who's supporting the scientific method says something like, well, that's a Marxist interpretation. It's a linear Marxist interpretation. And then the Venezuelan doctor says, well, it might be a Marxist interpretation, but that's not what Marxists say. And I think she starts it by saying, pero mi hija, mi amor, so like saying, but look, it's a reality. We have to accept it. Maybe the theory doesn't fit or can't explain it, but it's something that we have to look at and examine.
Well, I'm also interested in the fact that the shift is brought up, that it is acceptable as science, that science itself has different models of how to deal with things. And if we look at Einstein's version of this, I almost stumbled and said, I'm such a film professor, I almost said Eisenstein.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, so, but Einstein's way of this, that you're not dealing with separate categories, that time is part of space, then all of a sudden we're getting a scientific model that at least is more accommodating to this. Not saying that they're a perfect match.
They're not.
They're not, but that this is not per se contra science. It's another way of knowing, and that we have to go after it in those ways.
Caribbean culture is very complex. It's very different. It's very unique. It accepts many multiple realities and differences, and one has to be open to it. The movie is open to it. I think the movie celebrates, it's a celebration of that difference. Through the character of Amanda, I think the movie celebrates that which is distinct in the Caribbean. I mean, that's the way the movie ends, if you remember, right? We're in that big plaza in La Habana, and there's magicians, there's musicians. It's a celebration of that spirit, of that rhythm, of the multi-rhythms, right, that make up the Caribbean.
Well, and you bring up, you'd mentioned just a little bit earlier, a very significant book in Cuban, but also more broadly Caribbean studies, and that is Antonio Benitez Rojo's,
The Repeating Island.
The Repeating Island, in which he's one of a number of critics who thoughtfully speaks about why is Carnival so important in the Caribbean.
And also, if you remember the study, there's in one passage he writes, if I had to pick one word to describe the Caribbean, that word would be performance. It's about performance, and she is the performer. Amanda is the performer who wants to perform, who wants to be out there, who wants to show her talent, who wants to share her talent. So I think she really very much represents the Caribbean culture.
Well, and I think you bring up a very interesting point about how the film is very self-conscious about that, because if you look at the motif, not merely of having this great actress here, but of the fact that we have the repetition of the flamenco performance and her assumption of that persona through each actress, and then finally to the footage of the real woman, Maria Esteves, whatever. Right.
It's fascinating, and I couldn't help but thinking from the beginning when you see the gypsy dance or the flamenco dance of Lorca. I mean, Lorca comes to mind because what did Lorca do? He celebrated gypsy ballads. That is, individuals who were marginalized, right? Who he wanted to sing to. She is a marginalized because she doesn't fit. She doesn't fit in a nice, category. That's why I think the film is a celebration of her. I mean, that's what it intends to do.
Right. Well, it's also a kind of return to a how shall I put it, a version of Cubanness, of Cubanidad,
Yeah.
that is an inclusive one.
It is inclusive, yes.
That is certainly a version. Well, like in all societies, but in Cuba, there's always this debate about what we can include and what we don't. Much earlier in the century, one of those chief debates was, and you again mentioned one of the major scholars of this, of somebody like Fernando Ortiz.
Right.
He begins by studying the Negroes
Right.
of Cuba because he studies it from a criminological perspective, because that's the only thing given
Right.
to him at that moment, but then ends up being this tremendous advocate of
Correct.
the richness of the tradition, and someone who's saying, no, I began as somebody to figure out how we could turn them into us, and now all of a sudden I'm seeing the richness here. And I think there's a bit of that going on
By all means.
in the film, which also has to do with the moment in which the film is made. This is a film that is made in the late 1990s.
Right.
The collapse of the Soviet Union
Correct.
is 10 years ago. Officially, we are in a republic dedicated to the ideals of Marti,
Right.
not of Marx, which is not to say the effects of the
Right.
years of Marxism or not there. But this is having to reinvent yourself,
Right.
yet again.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned Martí. I thought of Martí when I was watching the movie because, Martí in Nuestra América, that very famous essay, he talks about that we can't use foreign models to explain who we are. We can't use, the history of Greece to understand who we are in Cuba. So here we go again, back to the idea. We can't use these scientific methods, or maybe we can use them, but they can coexist. But we also
Right.
have to recognize who we are, and who we are in the Caribbean we're many different, many different languages that we speak, many different, belief systems that we have, Afro-Cuban religion, for example,
Right.
Syncretism, things like that, things of that nature.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So I find that it's interesting that, how shall I put it? This is something that claims to be a real case.
What I found interesting about that, it only comes to you at the end of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
That is, it's presented to you as fiction or make believe, and all of a sudden at the end you're kind of shocked and say, "But wait a minute, this was a real person then." I mean, what why wait until the end to give us this denouement, right? I mean, it is the end, it is the denouement, but why isn't it that we didn't get this information at the beginning? This is based on a true story.
Right. Well, what's also interesting to me about that is the fact that since the claim is so strongly outside of the things that are usually captured by realism, okay, that what you have is a film that talks about all of this phenomenon that, how shall I put it, avoids the high tech. Now, in one reason, out of necessity, not available, but also because there's this very straightforward treatment of this.
Right.
That no special effects are needed. To be sure, there is some editing to show us
Right.
certain kinds of things, but it's almost in a nice way, a clinical approach to the extra scientific. So
Right.
you have this woman who's been denied schooling,
Right.
who's been denied this, who's walking around and giving dictation to doctors. And then there's the charming moment in which she says, "There's nothing wrong with
Right.
it.
Right.
You're trying to trick me." Now
Right,
that's
exactly.
you shouldn't
Right.
you shouldn't be doing that.
Right. Right.
Let's talk a little bit about this notion of further in another direction about performance. There are some pretty strong scenes,
Right.
Here.
Right, you're talking about the scene of the despojo,
Yeah.
right? The cleansing scene, right?
Right.
Which is a very interesting scene because I think it's the first scene where we see the adult Amanda, right? And she's already set up shop. I mean, she has claimed a voice for herself. She is visible. People are coming to her door asking for consultations. And this grandmother comes, because she's very concerned about her grandchild who's sick. And there's that moment, obviously, which is a moment of Santeria,
Right.
Afro-Cuban religion, right? Where she is possessed by the voice of Francisca, right? And then her son, Juan Carlos, is there to interpret and say. I thought there was one interesting moment at the end, which was very cute, where she says something like, or Juan Carlos says, translating, says, well, you need to do this. You need to take this doll and do all of this, and that'll take care of it. But you should listen to the doctors too. I mean, they're okay. They're okay. Their work is fine. It's not going to hurt, right? But this is really going to help you, right? Yeah, it's a very cute scene, I thought. Yes.
Yeah, no.
But it's a very provocative, moment where she is, gyrating and, and very much, part of Santeria rituals. Right. She's smoking her cigar. She's drinking her coffee. At the beginning, she's using her herbs to.
Absolutely.
What's interesting, again, there you see the syncretism because she starts with a Padre Nuestro and Our Father, and all of a sudden we go from Our Father to the white dove, to the herbs, to the despojo, and to the cigar, and I mean everything is just coexisting at the same time there. But I think it captures that, those rituals.
Yeah, no, I'm in full agreement with you. One of the things I'm interested in is also how different people use this. That is, the reach of this. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, you have the reach of it all the way to Spain for the notion of someone who finds this, useful. Why? Because for him it works.
Right.
Okay. Right. It's as simple as that. I was reading a scholarly study of Santeria recently, and it was talking about the fellow who had been doing all the work was then met a fellow who went to the first sort of study of this. He says, well, why do you get involved with something like this? And the Western trained scholar, he said, he said why? The reason I'm involved is because I watch it work.
Right.
I watch it work within the culture. Right. I'm absolutely fascinated by that. But we see that actually in the picture of the phone calls, say, to Spain.
Right, exactly. Right. And there's a funny moment in there too, but when she says, I think they're stealing your car, and then he has to run out. So, I think Cuban humor is in the whole movie, which obviously is special moments, special moments in Cuban cinema.
And then another thing that's interesting to me is that while we have the sympathetic portrait of the Spaniard and absolutely the funny scene about, no, stop, go look for your car, etc., we have the issue of the ethics of representation of this that comes up through the ambitious young television reporter.
Right.
And so, which is, by the way, something that I think is both about the specific ethics of representing her. How do you represent it? But also is a little bit of the jibe between the film and television worlds.
Right.
In
good observation.
In Cuba itself, whereas the filmmakers have through the years tried to define themselves whenever possible as this voice of exploration, both of the revolution and of the culture, whereas the television has operated much more within the straitjacket of having to be at all points this voice. Though interestingly enough, this fellow is much more a Western-style exploitative journalist.
I think so. And that's why the Venezuelan doctor is so intent on protecting her. And I think she takes it as her responsibility to make sure she's not exploited, right?
Right. Well, and also you bring up the interest of just the character being the Venezuelan doctor.
I couldn't remember her name. I don't even know if they mentioned the name in the movie, but that's the way I refer to her.
She comes up in the chapter title says La Venezolana, the Venezuelan.
Okay, there it is. She said she loved everything Cuban, so that's why she was in Cuba, right?
Right, and she had come there and that. So what I'm interested in is not only this proposition about the coexistence of these systems of knowledge within Cuba itself, being a model, but also the way in which, if properly used and appreciated by others, it can be a model. It can be a model for other people, and we have that with the Spaniard, and we have that with the Venezuelan doctor, herself in there.
Right. Another aspect of the movie, which I think it's kind of a very short reference, which perhaps could just be lost. Since we're talking about marginal figures and people who are on the fringe, like Amanda, there's a moment when the gentleman that she meets, the man who dies, Adolfo, actually, and the actor's name is Adolfo too, who mentions that he's a literature professor.
Very important point.
Right.
Yeah. Talk to us.
And he talks a little bit about the fact that he's teaching Virgilio Piñera. Now, to mention Virgilio Piñera, and then to say at one moment to her, you remind me of Virgilio Piñera, he says to her. You're distinta y rara, right? Different and strange like he was. He was pobre, un artista y homosexual, right? You were poor, an artist, and homosexual, but you're not homosexual. So one wonders why Piñera is brought into that. is there an attempt, one can ask, to perhaps to equate the marginal Amanda, who's on the fringe, with the homosexual also, who has been in the fringe? And as you well know, there's been a controversy in Cuba since the beginning of the revolution with the role or the place of homosexuality within the society.
Absolutely.
Very early on, persecuted, and homosexuals persecuted, concentration camps, really the worst, So there's an attempt, to perhaps give a space or to reclaim those writers that have been lost. A book was just recently published in 2001, Chicago University Press, Emilio Vejel. It's titled Gay Cuban Nation, where he does a whole analysis of the homosexual within Cuban society prior to the revolution, actually from Martí, who actually he claims that Martí, and I think rightly so, was uncomfortable with what he called the effeminate man and the masculine woman, right? And then all through the 1920s and the feminist movement in Cuba, to what happened, in the revolution, in the beginning of the, the revolution and, the persecution of homosexuals, up to what he calls 1990, which was a shift, right? And I know we're probably getting a little bit away from the movie, but I think that the reference is so, it's short in the movie about Piñera, but it's so important because one would ask themselves, well, why is he mentioning this, And then associating her. I mean, he's making the connection with her and Piñera, right?
One of the things is the literature professor does give the explanation of you have to consider things from a value system outside there, and makes the argument about the necessity of multiple points of view to understand reality, which is from the literary side as opposed to from the scientific side that we've seen.
Exactly.
We've seen earlier. Well, I love it when a guest says exactly, even though I'm going to have to, I'm going to have to cut you off agreeing with me on that, because we've come to the end of our.
We have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this is very enjoyable.
Goes by very fast.
It does.
Yeah. Let me suggest to you at home that if you'd like more information about City Cinematheque, there's an easy way to get it. And it's not a surprise these days. Go to our website. You can find information about this series and about CUNY TV in general at www.cuny.tv. Again, that's www.cuny.tv. You'll find all the click-ons to communicate with us. It's a pleasure having you here, Francisco.
Thank you so much, Jerry.
Hope you'll come back sometime for things Cuban, Caribbean, or whatever.
Whatever. Thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure. And I hope that you join us once again watching City Cinematheque when we do our best to pull from the archives of film history those things that are of, I think, great interest to all of us. Thanks for joining us today.